Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, I would like to cordially welcome you to our online discussion, Vaccine Access 2 years into the pandemic. Still, no one is safe until everyone is safe. My name is Eva van der Agt. I am the director of the European Union Office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, the German Green Political Foundation. During our today's event, we will discuss how an equitable global distribution of vaccines can be achieved. It is clear that a successful pandemic response requires coordinated global action. It requires knowledge and technology transfer. The swift delivery of vaccines to countries of the global south is a useful interim measure, but it is not enough. It is neither reliable nor sustainable. Instead, the countries of the global south must be supported in setting up their own production capacities for vaccines, tests, and medicine to combat the spread of COVID-19. In the medium and long term, we need to address structural questions of global healthcare and global justice so that the whole world, rather than just small parts of it, is better prepared for future challenges. In 2020, India and South Africa asked the World Trade Organization for a waiver from certain provisions of the trade-related aspects of intellectual property TRIPS agreement for the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. The provisional compromise between the European Union, the United States, India, and South Africa, which still lacks formal approval, is a positive indication that there has been movement towards a TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 vaccines in the last weeks. This is, of course, good news. However, civil society organizations stress that excluding treatments and diagnostics is a critical weakness of this compromise and an obstacle to tackle the global inequality in access to treatment and prevention of COVID-19 infections. Today, we will have a close look at the challenges ahead of us and discuss what the European Commission and the European Parliament can do to foster global vaccine equity. I am very pleased that 3 distinguished experts accepted our invitation. Due to illness, please allow me to excuse Barbara Unmüßig, President of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. She is very sorry that she had to cancel her participation. The discussion will be moderated by Shada Islam, founder of the New Horizon Project and magazine editor at the EU Observer in Brussels. I am now looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Shada, the floor is yours.
Eva, thank you so much indeed for this very kind start for this wonderful panel. As you say, I'm really delighted to be here and to be moderating this conversation. Friends, all of us, we live in very, very challenging times. We have war in Ukraine, war in Europe, but let's remember that the COVID-19 pandemic has not gone away, and the inequalities it has revealed across the globe are still with us and still have to be tackled. Eva has started off by telling us that no one is safe until everyone is safe, and a great deal still needs to be done to reach that level of safety for everyone. We've talked about the TRIPS waiver, the recent compromise, a surprising compromise, but a welcome compromise, but also, I have to say, an incomplete compromise. To discuss these questions of global equity for vaccines, let's turn now to our panel. So we have brought together Anna Cavazzini. She's member of the European Parliament from the Greens EFA group and chair of the European Parliament Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection. Thank you very much for joining us, Anna, and welcome. Joining us also is Maria Martin-Pratt. She's Deputy Director General at the DG Trade at the European Commission in Brussels. Maria joining us. Thank you so much as well. And also Dr. Ayoade Alakisha. She's co-chair of the African Union Vaccine Delivery Alliance and the WHO Special Envoy for the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, joining us as well. Let me turn now to you, Anna. First of all, you've been a very strong advocate for the waiver on the TRIPS patent agreement. And I was wondering, what is your impression? What's your perception now of this compromise, this rather sudden but welcome compromise that we've reached now on the patents waiver? Screen is yours, Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much for the nice introduction and also for organizing this webinar. I think it comes really in a very timely manner because indeed, as you said, we have now finally a compromise on the table. I mean, first of all, I would also really welcome the fact that now, after the European Union and also other states blocking the negotiations for a very long time, there is now a compromise, at least a workable compromise on the table. Of course, I deplore it very much that we lost so much time, because I think especially when it comes to a pandemic, time and speed is really of essence. And the fact that we lost so many months, years, in order to really spread immunity worldwide, in order to fight the pandemic properly, this is not good, but better than nothing. Now we have the compromise off the table, and also, as Eva van der Rack said at the beginning, and as you mentioned, of course, it is incomplete. It is not what we in the European Parliament actually also 2 times had been asking for, like a complete, a full TRIPS waiver that also includes therapeutics and also other issues, other trade secrets, for example. But nevertheless, I think it's something that we can start working on. I just hope that in the course of the discussions, when we see, okay, there is probably still improvements being proposed by other WTO member states, that the EU is equally open to improvements if these suggestions come up. And I also hope that we really learn a lesson from that and prepare us better for future pandemics, but also for future equal distribution of medicine and access to medicine worldwide.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to turn to you, Maria. Before I do that, let me just say that we do have interpretation in German, French, and English. And of course, while I conduct this conversation, we're also very ready. In fact, we want to hear from you as well. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're all used to Zoom links now. Please put your questions there, and I will take them and give them to the panelists for responses as well. So, Anna, thank you very much for saying that we have indeed lost so much time, and you're absolutely right. And there's no more time to be lost, because the global economic recovery depends on it. Also, of course, our relationship with many developing countries depend on it. This is very much a geopolitical question as well. Our reputation as a European Union is at stake, and we saw that at the African Union Summit with the European Union just a few weeks ago. So, Maria, let me turn to you now. The European Commission in the past has been quite steadfastly against a TRIPS waiver, and I was just wondering, from your point of view now that we have this compromise, incomplete though it is, what are the next steps forward? When do we actually get an agreement, and when we do start implementing it, do you think?
Thanks very much, and very happy to be here. Very happy to see Anna Cavazzini again. We normally discuss other issues than vaccines, but very, very glad to be here today to discuss this particular issue that has taken quite a bit of my time as well in the last few months. Let me, before getting into where we are and how we go forward, put a little bit of context on one issue, because I think it is important. We all agree, as you were indicating at the beginning of your intervention, that we need to ensure that everybody is safe, and that we need to address the lack of access to vaccines, whether it's in Africa or any other place in the world. And we also are absolutely of the view that in order to avoid problems, whether it is with these or future pandemics, one of the things we need to do is to boost up the manufacturing capability of many parts of the world that don't have it. That doesn't mean that you're going to have a manufacturing capability of very complex medicines in each country in Africa, but you do need to have a manufacturing capability that makes sure that continent is not, as it is at the moment, 99% dependent on imports. That is a very dangerous situation to be in, as we saw when India decided to close its exports of COVID-19 vaccines. The second thing that I think it is important to make clear, we've discussed a lot about the IP waiver, and I'll get to it, but we should not lose sight of the fact that we need a comprehensive approach. Many of the problems that we saw during the pandemic had nothing to do with IP. For instance, one of the biggest problems was related to export restrictions. Other problems were related to lack of transparency as to where we could have specific ingredients, specific equipment, specific availability of certain medicines. What I'm trying to say here is, from the beginning, in the context of the WTO, we have and we continue to advocate a comprehensive approach in relation to trade and health. And that has commitments in relation to trade facilitation measures, improved transparency, restraint from export restrictions, expanding of production capability. So if you want, IP plays a role there, in particular in relation to the expansion of production capability, but is by far not the only element. Now, on the IP front, we were very active from the beginning. And I think, like with all negotiations, what happens is that the more you engage, the more you discuss, both parties get to understand better as well the position of the other. We were and continue to be of the view that doing away completely with the protection of IP will not benefit anyone, will not benefit the developing countries that what want to do is to attract the investment and the capability to manufacture that their countries want to develop. And this is not just an estimation. This is something that we see in reality. People often forget that least developed countries already under the TRIPS agreement have no obligation whatsoever to respect IP rights. And you have least developed countries like Bangladesh that don't have to respect it and that have local pharmaceutical companies. Nevertheless, they have not tried to say we're going to waive rights, because what they really know is that they need to negotiate with and cooperate with the pharma companies. At the same time, what we did realize when working in particular a lot with South Africa, who was also obviously representing the African group, is that there were concerns related to two things. I think one big concern was not having sufficient clarity as to what a government can do. The second concerns were related as to cumbersome requirements included in the TRIPS agreement that could slow down, in particular when we're talking about export of vaccines that have been manufactured to countries that don't have that manufacturing capability. And it's around that understanding that we started building a compromise outcome, which basically it's important because it does provide the legal certainty and the ease of functioning that South Africa, on behalf of the African countries, were looking for. It does base the whole solution on what we call government authorizations, i.e. the possibility to authorize the use of a patent without the consent of the right holder. And it does include a number of clarifications and waivers to facilitate, in particular, the domestic production and the export, because as I say, you're not going to have a situation where all of the African countries, for instance, do have manufacturing capability. I'm happy to enter into more details later, but I just wanted to explain what is the core of the waiver, and then where do we go forward from here? That is a very good question. It's always a very complex question in the WTO. You know, negotiations in a multilateral fora are never easy. And the organization at the moment is in a difficult context because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We are normally going towards a ministerial conference, the one that should have taken place before Christmas last year. but that had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And normally we will be going towards it for the second week of June. At the moment, you have a compromise outcome that reflects the interests of big parts, because South Africa, as I said, was all the time keeping in mind the situation or the position of the African group. You have India, you have the US, obviously, and you have us, but there are many other countries. And that is the type of discussion that needs to happen. And again, it also needs to happen in the context of a larger discussion on trade and health, where we also take commitments, as I was saying, in relation to transparency, in relation to trying to avoid export controls, etc. So it's still a process that needs to happen, and that I hope gets landed for the ministerial conference. I think that's what we need to work towards.
Thank you very much, Maria. So as you say, a very complex question, and the WTO Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has in fact welcomed this compromise, calling it a major step forward, but insisting also that we are not there yet. And she says we have more work to do, and we need the support of the entire WTO membership. So indeed, that is going to be a long process, as you said. And the compromise, somebody asked the question already in the Q&A box, is actually, if I understand it correctly, the lifting of IP rights for COVID vaccines. But as Anna Cavazzini pointed out, it doesn't cover medicines needed for the treatment and prevention of COVID infection. So that is in fact the compromise at the moment. So it needs a long way to go still before it's actually implemented. Am I right in considering saying, Maria, that you also, before you go to the WTO, need the approval of all 27 EU governments as well?
Yes, indeed. Once you when you want to formalize a compromise, you need to do that. I mean, for the time being, you have seen the compromise outcome, and obviously is something that member states have been part of it. It's not that they were just surprised by it. Now we need to see whether that shape is kept, and then we do have the process to have the adoption. We normally need to have, in any event, a mandate for the whole of the ministerial conference, MC12. Let me get back to a point that keeps coming back as to the compromise not being sufficient because not covering diagnostics and therapeutics. The European Union from the beginning signaled that it was ready to include diagnostics and therapeutics in the solution. You don't have them up front because other parties came with the red lines to the negotiation, but I think it's important that I indicate it is not the European Union. Nevertheless, I think we have a good outcome, a second best, which is a commitment within 6 months to decide on the application of the solution to therapeutics and diagnostics. So it is a short period, if you want. And again, I'm not saying this is the best outcome. And as I say, we could have gone upfront with the whole scope, but let's not forget that is there as well.
Thank you very much, Maria. We'll come back to the broader questions of health, infrastructure and trade in a minute. But Anna, I wanted to ask you to respond a little bit to Maria, because Maria has talked about how important it is that it is okay. She recognizes, if I'm not mistaken, the shortcomings, but it is a step forward. And I was just wondering, you said initially that you're going to keep, or from your side, from the Parliament, keep hoping and acting in favor of improvement. So what stance is the Parliament going to take, your committee, yourself going to take in these crucial months ahead to make sure that, as you said, we don't stagnate and the political momentum, at least, that we've achieved so far doesn't just fall by the wayside?
Thank you very much. I think all of us individual MEPs had been in the last weeks talking a lot to our respective governments, because indeed, as you rightly said, of course, we need also the 27 member states approving the compromise. And I, as leads to my information that I have from the media, it's always also not easy as an MEP to get all the information. All the 27 member states are behind the compromise. So I think this is also an important work we are, of course, doing behind the scenes. And I think I have to probably also stress again, but I said it also at the beginning, that the Parliament from the beginning played quite an important role in pushing for that. And we always have a little bit this frustration, obviously, that we and that is always the case in trade agreements or trade policy, that we can have political resolutions, we can have debates in the Parliament, we have questions to the Commission, written questions, letters, whatsoever, but we don't have any legal power in that. And this is, of course, like it is, but of course that limits a little bit our power. But I still hope that the Commission also in the future takes our political discussions a little bit more seriously, even if we don't have any legal power. So, because I think we are connected very much also to the citizens, obviously, and we are like the elected body here in amongst all the institutions. And yeah, we're very early in calling actually for a TRIPS waiver. What I think is also interesting to mention is that we now have a special committee in the Parliament on the pandemic, on lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. And I think here it is crucial that this special committee also discusses the way forward on this special TRIPS waiver that is not a TRIPS waiver, but also on the more forward-looking future problem of access to medicine in general, or what happens in a pandemic. I think we as Greens, we will continue to push to improve this compromise. As I said, I don't know if this is at all feasible, but yeah, the question of course, therapeutics. I think the question also of clinical trials is important. That at least was the fact that a lot of companies told me that for them, and this was always also the struggle in the debate. I had a lot of contact to companies who said, okay, we can easily produce the COVID vaccine, while opponents of the TRIPS waiver also said, no, it's too complicated. Developing countries cannot produce that. I always had the opposite, but what a lot of companies told me, that for them, the big hurdle that they have to repeat the clinical trials is also something that takes time and money, and that should be basically included. That's probably another important aspect to mention. So to summarize, keeping up the pressure that we get probably even improved language, that we get this text adopted, but also trying to have in the Parliament a more forward-looking debate of access to medicine in general.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you very much, Anna. So I have a question coming in, which I think is really relevant. First of all, there was a question about what exactly the TRIPS compromise, and I think we've answered that. And there's a question from Andreas Wolf, which talks about saying that since these negotiations take so long, would it be helpful, he asked, to include some provisions to waive IP regulations and other trade-related obstacles in case of a pandemic in a coming WHO pandemic treaty? Would that need the agreement of the WTO, for instance? So I think this is something that a lot of people are actually talking about, isn't it? Which is about having a WHO pandemic treaty, which would be a wider ranging treaty going beyond just the intellectual property talks, but also about equity, cost of vaccines, access to vaccines, production facilities, etc. So Maria, perhaps you can inform us a little bit about this kind of discussion, because as we've said, pandemics are not going to go away. In this interconnected, globalized world, pandemics will be with us, and we have to be pre-warned and ready for them. So is this kind of pandemic treaty something that is being worked on seriously within the WHO? And then does it need to be approved or brought into the WTO frame as well?
Thanks. I'll reply to your question, and then if you allow me, I'll go back to the point Anna was raising as regards clinical trials to explain how this is covered by the compromise outcome. On the WHO pandemic treaty, I think the approach, as you were saying yourself, is a much broader approach. It does, I understand, I need to be clear, it's not a trade agreement, it's not something that DG Trade is leading in terms of negotiation, but my understanding, and for the input we also provide, is we're talking about a broader context as regards the health systems and what you do in the case of a pandemic. And I think a broad context is the right reason. I think if we limit the discussion to IP issues, we will not be changing the reality on the ground. It is as easy as that. And there are many complex reasons why you have a lower level of vaccination, for instance, in African countries. And this is becoming increasingly clear now that there is more availability of vaccines, and that the donations that have been given, including via COVAX, in some cases had to be sent back because there was no capacity to deploy them. So if we really want to help, we need to look on matters such as health infrastructure, transport, the training that you do require to have the persons that can give the vaccines. There is vaccine hesitancy as it exists also in many other countries. So this is not specific to any. But what I'm just saying is the overall infrastructure that you need is complex. And that's also why the European Union has committed to invest 1 billion euros in Africa to, among other things, back up the health infrastructure and the manufacturing capability. So I think a broader approach is welcome. You cannot, via WHO, change commitments that exist in other treaties, whether you're talking about the WTO or whether you're talking about the World Intellectual Property Organization treaties. So I don't think that is the manner in which this will work. I hope the discussion there is more on the broader whole picture and not a repetition of what we have already worked in WTO. Now, on the clinical trials, which I think is an important point, the compromise outcome clarifies a flexibility that already exists in the TRIPS agreement and that we ourselves in Europe have used in the past. Let me just very briefly say, when we talk about clinical trials, what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that once you have a medicine, and the vaccine is a top example of that, you need to conduct trials to make sure that they are not having pernicious effects. And you do this with vaccines for persons, you do it also for animals. In all countries in the world that have the capability to manufacture, you also have an independent separate regulator that gives authorizations for the product to be put in the market. That's necessary. It's a matter of health, public health. Now, it's absolutely right. The clinical trial that you need to produce in order to get the permission, so this is a manufacturing permission, it can be expensive to get because you need to test it in with large numbers of persons and meet a number of criteria. What we clarify in the outcome compromise is that when you are using the patent without the authorization, or the patents, because very often there will be more than one, without the authorization of the right holders, because you're granting a compulsory license, or because you're granting an authorization to use, for instance, on the basis of an urgency decree or other, you need to make sure that this is not blocked after by a clinical trial data, which means what? Means that the authorization for the vaccine that has been produced without the consent of the right owner can be granted on the basis of the data that already exists, because of that vaccine having been already tried, gone through clinical trials in order to get an authorization. And this is something, when I say is a flexibility that already exists in the TRIPS agreement, we have used it. You do have our internal market regulation that deals with compulsory license already provides for, if you want, an exception to the protection of regulatory data to the extent necessary to put that new vaccine on the market.
Thank you very much, Maria, also for that explanation. I think we do need to understand the complexities of all this, but there is a broader, Anna, isn't there a broader geopolitical question as well? I think in terms of, I'm very sorry to say that so far Dr. Alakija, who was supposed to join us, has not come in. So I'm asking you the question because you have been very much involved in also asking for this question to be on the agenda with the African partners, as I said, and of course it wasn't really pinpointed as an issue in the communique that came out. There was a very general reference, I think, and not actually a response to their demands. Do you think that these complexities and these questions that are still sort of hanging out there are going to influence in the medium term our relationship with the African Union in terms of our search, our quest for a equal partnership?
Yeah, thank you so much for this, I think, very important question. I think we saw from the beginning, and I had really personally the feeling that this made me so sad, that you saw actually huge vaccine deliveries with whatever the Russian flag on it, and of course they also staged this to third countries. And I know, and it's true that the European Union is one of the biggest exporters, one of the biggest contributors to also COVAX and so on. And I think this is really important to always mention. And the EU was differently to the US, also not blocking exports of ingredients. So I think this is also important to mention. I absolutely acknowledge that. But of course, we saw from this more geopolitical view or lens that there was really a problem, or at least a perception in a lot of countries that because of blocking the TRIPS waiver so much, that the EU is not on their side. And I think this is really deplorable, also given the fact that now we even have a compromise. And I think this could have really stirred a little bit differently. I think one problem was also a couple of months ago when Omicron emerged, and I even mentioned this in a plenary debate that got quite big in South Africa, that we immediately banned basically the travel from Southern African countries and basically punishing them for being so transparent and also for sequencing the new variant. And of course, again, I acknowledge that there is, of course, the urge to protect EU citizens from new variants, and we didn't know how dangerous Omicron is. But I think these two things destroyed a lot of trust, and I think we saw it also at the African Union summit. So I think lessons learned for the future, I guess this is important, could be to in the future really having a stronger emphasis on also the geopolitical questions. Of course, there is the EU position on IP, and it is like it is, but I think there is also other things around it, and I think this was a little bit neglected in the first positioning of the EU. And at least in German, we say that a lot of porcelain had been crashed. I don't know what the English term for it is. I think the better now is that, okay, the EU moved, and I think we can really use this also in building new bridges again to the African countries and trying to build a new trust. And I think also this initiative by Commission President von der Leyen to help building new factories on African ground, things like this should be really promoted well. And I think this is something super important and also positive that came out of the, let's say, challenging situation.
Can I ask you, Anna, going forward also, of course, the EU has said, and you're absolutely right, we have to acknowledge all the efforts that have been made in terms of solidarity. You know, the commitment to put money into infrastructure, health infrastructure, production capacity in African and other developing countries, also the commitment to the COVAX initiative as well. Going forward, a lot of people are talking about the pandemic treaty that we need to be forward-looking. And of course, we're grappling with several let's say, geopolitical challenges at the moment. We've got the war in Ukraine, we've got COVID-19 as well. Our economic recovery is going to be challenged by both these developments, these very unfortunate developments. Looking ahead, how would you prioritize, and how do you think you can convince a European public about the need to keep the focus on the COVID-19 challenge, while also discussing Ukrainian refugees, the war in Ukraine? These are important geopolitical challenges for the European Parliament and the European institutions to try and find the way between these different, let's say, a very important goalposts that we have.
Yeah, it is, I think, a very difficult task, but I think very important is, and I think the Böll Foundation also does it very well often in its publications and so on, to talk about how all these multiple crises are interconnected. I mean, we see now again, because of Putin's war, we have an increasing hunger problems in the global south, where the societies have not yet recovered even from COVID. So I think what is important to always put things in connection to each other, and the different crises in connection to each other. I have to say, I'm from a kind of public pressure point of view, I'm happy that we have this compromise now on the TRIPS waiver, because of course for us beforehand it was also a little bit easier to put it on the agenda, to really have public pressure in the media and so on. And I think now, of course, the topic disappeared a little bit also from the public eye. So that's why I think it was good timing that we had the compromise before the war really got bigger and dominated the public debate. Last thing to say, as I mentioned several times, and I think it's probably interesting to also hear from the Commission on that, what are the plans, because we know this whole fight about IP on the mRNA is also because this will be in the future probably the vaccine against cancer or against any other diseases. So it's not only about how to fight COVID, it's also about how we can make sure that in the future we not again have the same problem that we had with the AIDS HIV crisis, where the TRIPS flexibilities emerged at the end from, that we have a broad access to medicine also for the developing countries to an affordable price. And I think it is really time to rethink the IP model in general, because of course we need to have incentives that companies research, that companies develop new medicines and so on and so on and so on. But I think there had been in the past already a really interesting models brought forward how to structure this a little bit differently, have different incentives, probably also more public research, more public funding, and then a better access to these medicines, treatments, whatsoever for everyone.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I've just been told by my colleagues that Dr. Alakija will be joining us soon. So I'm really happy for that, because we need to get also some points of view from Africa directly as well. And please do put your questions in the Q&A box, because we have two, for the moment, very, very good experts on this issue. And of course, Dr. Alakija will be joining us as well. So I'll come to you, Maria, on the question, the very question that Anna has raised, which I think is extremely important, looking ahead, the lessons we're learning as we go on struggling with COVID-19, the very serious lessons we've learned about the need need for affordable prices, equity, as you said yourself, vaccine apathy or fatigue, if you like. Also the questions of transport, of training. Is there a forward-looking way? Are you at your DG Trade thinking ahead, perhaps with your health experts, in terms of how you can sort of fold all of these in for the future so that we don't find ourselves for 2 years struggling with a question of, say, intellectual property rights waivers or questions to do with, geopolitics, vaccine hoarding? So looking forward and trying to see how we can deal with the next crisis, which is surely going to come.
Well, it's a very complex landscape that you just referred to there, Shada. I think in terms of our own preparedness, we have learned lessons and we will be better prepared. I have no doubt about it, although obviously you never know what can come in the future. In terms of how can we help others being prepared, I really think that goes around what we can do as the European Union to support a continent like Africa. And I also think it needs to rely on the cooperation of companies with those countries, and both are important. On our side, as I was referring to before, we have a Team Europe approach. We refer to it as the Team Europe Initiative on Manufacturing and Access to Vaccines, Medicines and Health Technologies. It's a very long name, but the objective clearly is to strengthen the African pharmaceutical system and its manufacturing capacity to facilitate access to affordable and effective, not only vaccines, but also medicines and more broadly health technologies. Is €1 billion between what we have put with our budget and development financial institutions. We expect further contributions from the member states. And as I was saying before, we want to support the supply side, the demand side, and the enabling environment. And that enabling environment, from the regulatory environment to the governance of the authorizations on the pharma products, is very important. So that is essentially what we can do. But also, I think what is very important and is happening is the cooperation of the companies that have the technology and that have the know-how. One of the reasons why we have maintained that lifting IP is a really bad idea. It's not only because we have very strong doubts as a possible alternative system of incentives, and unfortunately, we cannot rely only in public funding to develop, to get the type of money you're talking about to develop vaccines. For a vaccine like Moderna, you can be talking about something like 4 billion euros for development. So in terms of the system of incentives, I think IP has demonstrated that it can provide the incentive. A different thing is whether we put or not limits when this is required. But going back to the issue of cooperation, that is going to be key, and we are seeing it happening now. I'm not going to say it is enough. I'm not going to say this will replace the action from governments, but you do have companies which are deploying cooperation initiatives in countries like Senegal, like Rwanda, like Angola, like South Africa. You have from the very creative idea of BioNTech that has what they call something like biocontainers, so like a turnkey facility that they can deploy in order to have production of vaccine COVID-19 now, but future other vaccines in the future. They are delivering that, putting it in place in Rwanda. You have Moderna working with Kenya. You have also cooperation between other pharma companies and South Africa. That is very, very important because you don't only need the investment in infrastructure, you need the transfer of know-how. And that is not something that lifting the protection of patents gives to you. Someone needs to teach you. You need to learn. And it is an extremely complex system. I mean, even many European countries don't have that facility, that possibility of production. My own country, for instance, does mostly fill and finish when we're talking about COVID-19 vaccines. So we should not underestimate how important it is to make sure there are incentives as well for the private sector to work with public sector to make the change on the ground.
Thank you, Maria. Anna, I will ask you to respond to what Maria has said about the private sector. I mean, one argument, of course, is that it is the millions of dollars of public money have gone into the question of development of vaccines, and so it shouldn't just be left to the private sector to actually decide. That we can, as governments and as public authorities, actually bring a certain degree of pressure, if you like to put it gently, on private companies to actually do the right thing. So let's get your question. And I'd love to take some questions from the floor as well. So don't hesitate to put your remarks and your comments in the Q&A box. Anna, screen's yours.
Yeah, and I mean, this had also always been an argument in the debates we had in the European Parliament and so on, that of course, there is the private companies, but we have to look at how much public money went into developing, for example, the vaccine. And it is direct public money. For example, BioNTech got direct funds from the German government, but of course it is also money that had been for years funding, for example, research at the universities. So the basic research that basically makes it possible for things like the COVID vaccine to being developed. And that is why I think, the public, I think we need in the future stronger requirements for giving out public money to say, okay, this is really connected with the condition. If you get public money, you need to do A, Y, Z. For example, sharing the vaccine with developing countries, or making it public after 5 years or whatsoever, because I think it cannot be that the taxpayers pay for it. And then, I mean, there was just the push news that BioNTech last year gained. So the pure gain was more than 10 billion euro. And okay, I like BioNTech. Yeah, it's a great company. I don't want to say anything against BioNTech, but I'm just wanting to put it a little bit in perspective. Wow, that's so much money, and it's fine. But I mean, it is, I guess, also not basically then unfair to ask them some things from the private companies. And of course, luckily we are not in a basically planned economy, but nevertheless, I think as you said, Sharda, we need also some public decisions on where research should go and where we need basically more medicines to being developed. I mean, NGOs are pointing, for example, to the problem for years that some of the diseases that mainly exist in developing countries and don't bring so much money are being neglected in research, because at the end you don't make so much profit with those diseases. I mean, all of these are issues I think that we need to tackle in the future. And I hope, and this is always the thing, that with the pandemic, with the huge problem, with the crisis, we learn from it and we make ourselves more resilient in the future. And I hope this discussions we had on the TRIPS waiver also help on that.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna. I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming in, and there's a question about the HERA that I think, it's from Marcin Drodzinka-Verhelle, and he says, HERA will inject millions of euros into research and development, including new vaccines. And it's about how much money is enough for the European Commission to start asking the private sector for a fair return on public investment. So that's a question, Maria, perhaps for you. And then there's a question about the technology transfer hub of the WHO in South Africa. Would it get the unrestricted support of the EU and the European Commission if these are the crucial resources that are needed to get more distribution of production facilities? So Maria, if you'd like to take on those two questions.
Yeah, and it's also gives me the opportunity to agree with Anna on the point of it's absolutely legitimate when you use public money to fund research, whether it is in vaccines or in anything else. You should be thinking as to whether you want to put conditions. I think, and as I say, this is something that comes up not only in relation to medicines, but I think it is absolutely good policy to consider the extent to which, if you are financing research that leads to an outcome that turns into property, whether it is tangible or intangible, that then you have conditions for the sharing of that property or the results of the research. What I think it is nevertheless important to be very clear, and the data is out there, that in terms of funding, and in particular if we are talking about the COVID-19 vaccines, or rather, if you want, the mRNA technology, these took years, not decades, of research that were funded privately. Governments came very quickly when the pandemic started to provide funding for the ramping up of manufacturing, big time, and of distribution. But the research part had already taken place for years, and in cases there was public money, but the large majority was private money. There is something that is just a hard reality. Now, in terms of the question, there was a question about ERA, but I think I forgot about it. I remember the one about the hub in South Africa, but not about ERA. You're muted.
After all these months of being on Zoom, we still make the mistake. I was saying, Maria, go with the one you've noted, and I'll go back and see the other one that was mentioned.
Okay, no, in terms of the support of the European Union to the hub in South Africa, yes, that support is there, including having, I think, if I remember well of memory, we have injected 40 million euros. So yes, the support for the hub is there, and I think the outcome compromise that should go ahead, hopefully, could also help accelerate things there.
Okay, so now the question for HERA is that they will inject millions of euros into R&D, including of new vaccines. How much money is enough for the European Commission to start asking the private sector for a fair return?
Okay, but I think I have replied to that at the beginning of my question. I think you know my answer.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. So Anna, if looking ahead, one of the things that we talk about quite a bit in Brussels is about partnerships, and health partnerships are now sort of becoming also very important, especially in EU-Africa relations, whether it's health connectivity, health transport, distribution, structures, etc. So do you think, in looking ahead, because I think what we need to do now is really focus on getting this IP waiver through and actually implement it, but also looking ahead and trying to work out the parameters of new forms of cooperation where, you know, when we are struck again by a global pandemic, we have the responses, we have the way, the tools, the instruments, policies and tools to go forward. So do you think a health partnership, which includes the private sector, which talks about infrastructure development, which talks about equity, health justice in a sense, should be part of any such conversations we have going forward with, say, African countries as a start?
Yes, I mean, I think first of all, it is always important to hear, for example, what the African countries themselves want. And I guess, and I hope the speaker that will join us soon can also talk about that, because I think, yeah, it's always interesting and good that we from the Brussels bubbles have our ideas, but I think first and foremost, we would need to look what the African countries really want and need and what they think is important for them. When it comes to like public-private partnerships, of course, we as Greens have always a little bit a critical perspective on it. Not that it's not working in general, but I think it would need to be very much looked at how it works, because especially health, I think, is a public good. And of course, we need to make sure that it is not all about like profit making at the end, but that you really cover the basic needs of the population and especially of the poorest. And that's why I think in case we increase the public-private partnerships or like the private-public corporations, we need to also really have very strong preconditions, requirements in order to make them work. What we in the basically from a German perspective, what we as Greens negotiated or put in the government coalition treaty of the new German government was to, in general, increase the health part of the development budget. And I know, of course, there's also millions of discussions of should we in the North decide on which topics we spend the money on, or should not that be also kind of a joint undertaking. But I think in general, especially when it comes to health and education, these are really the two, like the basic public needs. I think it is important to also increase the focus of the development budget or development spending, especially in countries that had been also much devastated by the pandemic, or where really problems showed up. So this is probably my 5 cents to the debate, but I'm not a development politician. This is what I have to put as a disclaimer.
Thank you very much. But I think we're beyond working in silos. I think in this kind of conversation, we need to bring our expertise together from wherever we are standing on this issue. So Maria, there is a response to what you said in the Q&A box. And Marcin Rusinska-Verhela is challenging you, but I think this conversation is going to be an unending one, so you don't need to answer if you don't want to. And challenging the narrative that the private sector laid the groundwork for the vaccines development. I think this question is going to be one that stays with us and will hover there, and I think we need to deal with it. Quite the opposite, he says. Much of the pioneering work on mRNA vaccines was done with government money. The drug makers could walk away with big profits. So it's something that, of course, I'm sure you've heard before, and I think we will need to tackle it as we go on. So I was just wondering if Dr. Alakija is there with us now. If she is, would you please speak up, as they say?
Hello, everybody.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, hello, this is Dr. Alakija. My apologies. I've sort of had various logistical challenges and travel and logistical challenges, but I am now here. Hi.
There you are. There you are. Wonderful to see you. So I don't know if you followed any of our conversation so far, but you've got about 15 minutes before we have to finish this conversation. Maria has to leave as well, but I'm so glad you've joined us. So we've been talking about the IP, the compromise, the partial compromise compromise on the IP waiver. We've talked about all the different challenges that we face in terms of equity, access to vaccines, transport, production, local production, manufacturing, and all the rest of it. I think what we need from you, Dr. Alakija, is really your take, because you have at some point,
Mäuschen, du brauchst dich doch nicht wegen jedem Scheiß immer erschrecken.
I can hear you.
Sorry. You have talked about in the past, I was reading some interviews you've given, and you've talked about your sadness and frustration. You've talked about a system, a health system, which has failed humanity. And I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit to us your point of view on this IP waiver compromise, partial though it is, but also the wider problem of vaccine equity. The screen is yours, Ayoda.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Ada. And I must apologize for the vagaries of the current COVID world, which means that one gets in airports or get stuck in various places. Very pleased to be here. Look, very quickly, I mean, what I've said is that the global infrastructure as a whole is broken. The global health infrastructure has failed us. It failed the high-income countries. It's failed the low-income countries. And now as we're talking about the current IP waiver compromise, this is a very, very important conversation. And I'm going to choose my words very carefully, but I'm going to be very, very precise on what I have to say. I think that the world has been negotiating for over 20 years to have. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We're not hearing you very clearly. I think everyone should turn their mics off, except, of course, Dr. Alakija.
Yeah. So the world has been negotiating for over 20 years. Is that better? Better? The world has been negotiating for over 20 years for low-income countries, low middle-income countries to be able to produce, be it vaccines, be it tests, be it whatever the tools are needed. I'm not going to limit it to any one thing. I don't want to be I don't want to be anybody to be picky about what I've said, but what we currently have on the table, the agreement or the compromise, I don't even like the term compromise. I think what it is it's a movement in the right direction. I think we can be absolute purists and say that, well, we want all or nothing. But if we say that, what we are going to get is nothing. What we're going to get is absolutely and exactly nothing. And what I want to do is use the analogy of the negotiations, what I refer to as it's referred to generally as the Arafat moment, when there was a choice for when Yasser Arafat was negotiating with the world for the borders for Palestine or for the borders for that territory. And there was an offer on the table for X number of borders. I might get it wrong. I'm not going to use the exact terminology right now so that nobody, the purist doesn't say that was wrong. And the hardliner said we have to go for 100%. The hardliner says we're not going to accept what is a movement in the right direction, because you have to get your foot in the door. If you don't get your foot in the door, then you can't actually hold the door open to move in and push in further. And they said no. So what they did was they wanted 100% and they said no. And therefore what they got was nothing. And today he is gone. The position that was held at that time is gone. And now the world, the entire world, because it is not just the Palestinian territory or Palestine, the world has nothing. My belief, and this is my opinion, and I shared by some, but not everybody, is that we need to get our foot in the door, that right now we need to go for something that allows Africa, that allows low middle income countries of the world to produce something. It is a movement in the right direction. I don't want to call it a compromise, because a compromise sounds absolute. And we have to see that the EU and other, I mean, I've seen that, Germany is now potentially not in support of it. I'm not sure how true that is, how much of that is media language and terminology. But we have to work together as a global community, because this is a global problem that needs global cooperation, that needs global solidarity. We have to work together, be it WIPO, WIPO, be it WTO, be it national interests, be it continental interests like the AU. We have to work together to get a solution that ensures that we save our people. There is no point in taking a hard line that says that we are not going to yield until you give us 100%, because it is in the interest of those who already have the intellectual property to keep negotiating. It is in their interest to keep negotiating because nothing is changing. They're already producing. But it is in our interest to get our foot through the door so that we have the chance to begin to move along the right direction. So I don't like the term compromise, but I like the term moving forward and beginning to get some of the obstacles out of the way, beginning to, it is better. It is better to have I mean, I hate the term half bread is better than none, you know, but it is better to have something in hand. A bird in hand is worth 10 in the bush. That is my first comment to your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alakija. So thank you very much indeed. We all take your point, and I think Maria would agree with you that a movement forward has been made. I think all of us would agree with you. Just wondering, because we haven't had the opportunity to hear you before, the wider question of vaccine equity, not just the IPR waiver, which everyone says is a part of the conversation, but not the entire conversation. We have to look ahead. Where would you put the emphasis going forward? What needs to be done? And if I could just to Maria. Maria, I know you have to leave exactly at 3:15. So if you want to say something very quickly now in response to what Dr. Alakija has said, just say it very quickly now, and then I'll go back to Dr. Alakija.
I can very quickly, and very nice meeting you. It must have been a lot of stress in terms of running through transport and whatever you have had in terms of problems to get there. But good you got there. And I agree with you. I much prefer the term moving forward. Fantastic. I really think that is correct. Otherwise, just one thing for clarification. The outcome that you have seen is supported by all of the member states, and that obviously includes Germany.
Wonderful. Dankeschön.
Yes, Anna, do you want to come in very quickly before I turn back to Dr. Alakija on this optimistic, upbeat outlook? A step in the door, as she said it, a foot in the door. You're having trouble unmuting? Anna, are you having trouble unmuting? Okay. All right. There's trouble there. I'll go back to you, Dr. Alakija, and then turn to Anna. These things happen on when we're working with technology all the time. At least we can talk to each other. So let's go back to you and that wider question I had for you on vaccine equity. What else needs to be done?
No, thank you very much, Rada. Before I go direct to the wider vaccine equity, the other point I want to make that is a concern of mine around this foot in the door and the movement in the right direction with waivers is the fact that there seems to be a lot of misinformation flying around. Some of that misinformation says that the EU is requiring multiple authorizations and that the language that has been unfortunately leaked, and we would like to know by whom, but of course we will never find out, that the language is not actually in favor of countries producing. That is incorrect because we have done our homework. We have had meetings at the highest levels with the various organizations, with various governments, and indeed the movement that has been made is a positive move forward. So I also want to caution those of us who are activists to ensure that sometimes we go into fight mode and we're constantly in fight mode, but we have to remember that we are fighting for something and remember the something that we're fighting for. We cannot constantly and remain in a fight, but we have to sometimes remember to get a result out of that fight. And that is something I want to put out there because I know there are many listening right now to this. I'm not a technician. That is very highly technical subject, and I have delved into some of the technicalities, and quite frankly, they give me a headache. But so I leave that to those who know how to deal with it. But it has been the cry, my cri de coeur for the last 2 years, vaccine equity. So I'm going to speak about vaccine equity. What more is needed? What is needed is what I say all the time, is for a life in Harare to be valued as much as a life in Helsinki, for a life in Cairo to be valued as much as a life in Copenhagen. These are the things we need for lives to be valued equally all over the world. And this is the problem we have. Yes, supply is no longer so much of an issue. It is the supply challenges are easing, but we still have appliance challenges. We still have some countries that have vaccines but don't have the right syringes, because the syringe to deliver the Pfizer vaccine, for instance, is a very different syringe to the one that is needed to deliver the AstraZeneca vaccine. These are the logistical and supply challenges on the ground that people don't understand when they sort of say, oh, well, you know, Africa has all the vaccines she needs. Does she really? Many of them were still short shelf life vaccines, and we're dealing with that. Countries are insisting that bilaterally, because they don't want vaccines to expire on their own shores. So, you know, maybe some European or other countries from around the world who are donor countries are saying, well, we want to give you 5 million vaccines tomorrow. Why? Because we have held on to them for the last year and a half, and now they're about to expire. We don't want the headlines to say X number of vaccines expired in the UK or in you know, whatever, Icelandia. Let me find a fictional country so I don't offend anybody right now, you know. And so we want to send it off to you in Africa, knowing that there's no way you're going to be able to use and to deliver. Delivery is a challenge because delivery is complex. Logistics of delivery is complex. We have to get these vaccines from ports to arms. I recently convened a conference in Abuja, Nigeria, which brought together many of the key global actors to this global south for the first time. And what they saw was, even themselves just flying into the country, were the logistical and the practical challenges of the ground, just arriving as human beings, never mind of getting vaccines from Abuja, which is a point of entry of most of the vaccines, to the very furthest part of, you know, be it river state in the creeks and in the villages, or to the far north in the Sahel area of Nigeria, where it's actually a conflict and almost a war zone. So we have to understand the wider delivery challenges. Vaccine equity is still a problem, because there are those who are now arguing that we should just focus on 90%. I don't even want to mention that number, so forget I said that. The goal is 70%, global vaccination target of 70%, because high-income countries have vaccinated over 70% of their people with first, second, third, and now fourth doses going into people's arms. And yet there are those who would argue, there was a paper that was put out 2 days ago, that we should only focus on X percentage of the most vulnerable in low and low middle income countries. Why do you, who has 4 doses, get to decide who is vulnerable and who gets a dose in their arms in a low income country? It is wrong, it is immoral, and we as a global community, not just those of us from Africa, but all of us together, excuse me, need to push forward and say enough is enough. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alakesha. So we're coming towards the end of our conversation, but I do want to ask you a question that I had put earlier to Anna Cavazzini as well. So there was a great deal of hope that the EU-Africa summit that was held some weeks ago would have a reference, would have a commitment from the European Union on issues to do with equity, but also the IP waiver. And I was just wondering, looking ahead, how can African governments, people like yourselves also, activists and experts, keep the pressure on the European Union in its search for a partnership of equality with Africa to keep health issues higher up on this agenda, on this very important relationship?
I think we must keep the dialogue open. We have to keep talking to one another, which is why I ran through whatever corridors and rooms I had to run through today to get into this meeting. I think we have to keep talking. We have to understand. I think it is at the heart of our humanity, really. That's who we are created as human beings, to want to work together and to work together in partnership. What we must do is get rid of this paternalistic attitude. I think it is possible that we can work together towards equity, not just in vaccines. As you know, with my hat as special envoy for the ACT Accelerator and co-chair of that principles group, we're now working towards equity for diagnostics. We're working towards equity for treatments as these new treatments come up. I mean, people are working on monoclonal antibody treatments that will be a prophylaxis for all variants, which almost will, not replace vaccines, but are an adjunct or are an additional factor But these things are being worked on for high-income countries only. We need equity in diagnostics. People, there was a recent article that came out saying that, well, Africa has done well, that people are not dying in Africa. I mean, first of all, I find that really egregious, because how do you know? We're not testing. We don't have the diagnostics capacity, so we don't have diagnostics equity. And therefore, you are now saying you will not give us, or you will not allow us the right to produce either our own antivirals or our own vaccines, because you feel we have been disproportionately affected. But there's another part of that argument, which I think speaks directly to what you say with the EU-AU relationship. We don't know what this pandemic, well, I do know what this pandemic has caused in terms of geopolitical angst. I have said from the beginning of this crisis that this is not a health crisis. It is a geopolitical crisis. It is a socioeconomic crisis. It is an education crisis. It is a gender crisis. But we are now beginning to see the offshoot of the geopolitical side of it, as we see African countries who feel left behind, who feel abandoned, begin to veer away from their natural, in the past, traditional partners, and saying that when the chips were down, you don't care about us. When the chips were down, you have not come to, not our aid, but you have not come to stand side by side with us in sisterhood. I don't say brotherhood, I say sisterhood. In sisterhood, to help us work together towards a common goal. That is one thing. So we're seeing it play out in the geopolitical scene. We're seeing it play out in the alliances and the votes at the UN. We're seeing it play out in various ways. But the other place that we're going to see this play out is that we're not taking into account the effects potentially of long COVID. We don't understand this disease. We don't understand what it's doing to young people. We don't understand what it's doing to the economically productive segment of society. Right. So if they don't vaccinate them, if economically Africa falls off the cliff and people begin to pour into the Mediterranean and try to cross over into Europe, then is it then that Europe is going to say, oh, all of a sudden we want to, prevent that from happening, so we're going to pour billions? It is better to invest the billions today in fully funding the ACT Accelerator and fully funding vaccine delivery and therapeutics delivery and treatment delivery than to try and fix a problem once it has already occurred. The trillions of dollars in global economy that is being lost at the moment, that is a challenge for the EU-Africa relationship. And that is what we must keep talking about and we must help to fix together.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Al-Kashia. I'm sorry to Anna and to Maria, but I thought it was very important that we hear from the doctor about what Africa's aspirations are, and really through our dialogue with the European Union. So thank you very much indeed. I will not take up any more of your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Maria, Anna, and Dr. Al-Kashia for joining us for this conversation on vaccine equity, going much beyond the question that we started off with, which is the patent waiver, compromise or move forward. And so I would like to say to everyone, thank you very much. Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung also, thank you for organizing such an important conversation at such an important moment. Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.